In this video, we're going to be talking about what causes the aggregate demand to shift up or down. So remember that your aggregate demand curve is downward sloping with price on the y-axis and real GDP or real output on the x-axis. And we are talking about shifts of the aggregate demand curve to the right or to the left. Okay, so always distinguish between a movement along the curve versus a shift of the curve. And in the previous video, we were talking about why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. And in this video, we're going to be talking about factors that cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. So one factor is any change in consumption can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift up or down. Now, remember that aggregate demand is measured by real GDP, which is the sum of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So any changes to consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports is going to cause a change in aggregate demand, which is Y. Okay, so when you think about consumption, these changes can come about from things like if there's a stock market boom, for instance. This would increase consumption. People would feel wealthier, and they would spend more, and so aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. Okay. Similarly, you could have a scenario where there could be some kind of preferences that lead to consumers spending more. And so if consumption rises because people prefer to spend more, again, aggregate demand shifts to the right. And finally, if there is a tax cut, people would feel wealthier and they would spend more. So consumption would rise and aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. Okay, so you can apply the reverse reasons like a stock market crash or preferences for saving or tax hikes to suggest that aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. Now, you could also have shifts in the aggregate demand curve coming from changes in investment. So any event that causes firms to invest more at a given price level, any type of optimism about the future. So if firms are optimistic, they might invest more today, and that would increase investment and shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Okay, so again, investment would increase, aggregate demand curve would increase, and then shift to the right. Okay. So expectations could play one role. You could also have interest rates that fall. That could increase investment. So if monetary policy is such that it leads to a reduction or a decrease in interest rates, again, investment would rise if interest rates are falling because it's cheaper to borrow. And any kind of investment tax credit that leads to an increase in investment would also lead to a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Now, any type of government spending, an increase in government spending by the federal authorities or federal government or the state government or the local government, if they're spending more, again, government spending is going to go up, and that would lead to Y going up, and that would be again reflected in a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So aggregate demand curve would increase, and that would be a rightward shift. And similarly, so you can also have scenarios where You have net exports going up, and that leads to a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. This could be something like a boom in Canada or Mexico, and these are our trading partners. So a boom in Canada and Mexico are good news for our exports, because those goods are imports for them, and so you would have our net exports go up if those countries are doing well and growing. And so this is one reason why you could have an aggregate demand curve shift to the right, okay? And the other is if the US dollar depreciates in value. So depreciation would mean that, let's say we were comparing the US dollar to the Mexican peso, and maybe in 2018, I'm making these numbers up, in the exchange rate was 12 Mexican pesos per US dollar, right, against the dollar. And in 2020, you get 10 Mexican pesos for a dollar. This would mean that now we're getting less Mexican pesos for the dollar, so our exchange rate has depreciated. Now, when our exchange rate depreciates, of course, we feel the pinch if we travel to Mexico, right? Because we would only get 10 Mexican pesos in exchange for a dollar now than we were getting earlier. But it is still good news for US exporters, because now the US goods and services are cheaper relative to a world in world markets. And so any depreciation of our currency is good news for our exports, and that would usually increase net exports and again cause a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve.